today's class, we will discuss about the concept of folk and folklore, and from there on we will go to discuss what is folk art. So, the idea of folk. In any standard dictionary, you will see that the definition of folk has been defined as such. In noun form, it is defined as people in general, used as a friendly form of address to a group of people or the members of one's family, especially one's parents. In adjective form, it has been used to relate to this traditional art or culture of a community or a nation, relating to or originating from the belief and opinion of ordinary people. Studies about folk. The discipline of folklorist began in 19th century. One can find precursors in the 18th century usage of the term Volkslied meaning folk song, Volksseele meaning folk soul, and Volksglaube means folk belief by German philosopher Herder. His famous anthology of folk songs Stimmen der Willkür in Liedern was published in 1778-79. But folklorist in the sense of the scholarly study of folklore did not emerge until later. The English word folklore was coined by Thoms in 1846, closely tied to the currents of romanticism and nationalism. The serious study of folklore found an enthusiastic audience among individuals who felt nostalgia for the past and the necessity of documenting the existence of national consciousness or identity. The critical difficulty in various 19th century usage of the term lay in the fact that it is inevitably defined as a dependent rather than an independent entity. In other words, folk was defined in contrast with or in opposition to some other population group. The folk were understood to be a group of people who constituted the lower stratum, the so called vulgus in populace, in contrast with the upper strata or elite of that society. The folk were contrasted on the other hand with civilization. They were the uncivilized element of a civilized society, but on the other hand they were also contrasted with the so called savage or primitive society, which was considered even lower in the evolutionary ladder. Folk as an old fashioned segment living in the margins of a civilization was, and for that matter still is, equated with the concept of peasants. The way in which folk occupied a kind of middle ground between the civilized elite and the uncivilized savage can be perceived in emphasis placed upon a single culture trait, the ability to read and write. The folk were understood to be the illiterate in a literate society as opposed to the primitive people who were ethnocentrically labeled preliterate, implying that they would achieve literacy as cultural evolution progressed. In terms of the assumed unilinear cultural evolution sequence of savagery, barbarism and civilization through which all people were believed to pass. Through this form of the comparative method, historical reconstruction of the origin of the elite, literate, civilized European culture was to be undertaken. However, with the works of folklorists like Alan Duns, Richard Dawson, etc., the usage of the term folklore expanded and it began to include the corpus of knowledge of and about any group which share at least one common trait. Alan Duns in the study of folklore has described the term folk as such. The term folk can refer to any group of people whatsoever who share at least one common factor. It does not matter what the linking factor is. It could be a common occupation, language or religion, but what is important is that a group formed for whatever reason will have some tradition which it calls its own. In theory, a group must consist of at least two persons, but generally most people consist of many individuals. A member of the group may not know all the members, but he will probably know the common core of tradition belonging to the group, traditions which help the group have a sense of group identity. So then, who is a folk? Among others, we are. So technically speaking, a folk is any group that express its inner cohesion by maintaining shared tradition qualify as folk, whether the linking factor is occupation, language, place of residence, age, religion or ethnic origin. And folklore is the knowledge that the folk group possesses. Folklore consists of knowledge, legends, music, oral traditions, oral history, proverbs, jokes, popular belief, fairy tales, stories, tall tales and customs included in the tradition of a culture, subculture or group. It also includes a set of practices through which these expressive genres are shared. The study of folklore has divided the folkloric material into 4 divisions. First is oral literature. Oral literature, verbal art form, folk literature or expressive literature are spoken, sung and voiced form of tradition utterance. Oral narrative is a big subdivision of this group, which in turn has its own manifold distinction. For example, myth, fairy tale or marchen, romantic tale or novella, religious tale, folk tale, legend, animal tale, anecdote, joke, numbskull tale, etc. are the major form of oral narrative genre. Another major division is oral poetry or folk poetry. For example, folk epic, ballads, folk song, lullabies, work songs and songs associated with rituals and rites such as birth, marriage and death are commonly found in almost all parts of India, which is the rich oral poetry connected with festive occasions, feasts and ceremonies. Proverbs and riddles are also an important part of oral literature. Besides this major form of oral literature, there are minor forms which also fall under the above rubric. They are chants, prayers, laments, cries and even holers. The next is material culture. The physical folklore is generally called material culture. Material culture responds to techniques, skills, recipes and formulas transmitted across the generation. Folk costume, folk architecture and folk food are some examples. The third is social folk customs. The section of folklore is concerned with the family and communitarian observance of the people, rites of passage, of birth, initiation, marriage, death and similar rites are few examples. Songs and tales and other forms of oral literature associated with the rites form an essential part of oral literature, while the social custom and ritualistic observation may fall under the social folk custom. The last is performing folk art. The section concerned primarily music, dance and drama. But we must bear in mind that in the Indian folklore, these divisions are not watertight. They have many overlaps. We will come to see in the next classes. We must also mention about 2 important pioneering work in the field of folklore. First is the Grimm Brothers Fairy Tales, which is a collection of, initially it was a collection of 86 stories and it was published in 1812. The 7th edition was published in 1857, which contained 211 stories. The next is James George Fraser's 2-volume work known as the Golden Bough, Study in Comparative Religion, which was later changed to the Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion. These 2 are pioneering works in the area of folklore. Now, we come to the section folk art. Folk arts are not mere items of aesthetic gratification. They are art of the common people. Folk art carry a world of symbolic meanings that are windows to community life. Folk arts are the artwork that contain essence of traditions. The art forms range from visual, narrative and performative. The visual arts are predominantly functional or utilitarian, created by hand or with limited mechanical aid for use by the maker or by a small group. These art are often learned by observation without any formal training, and the skills are handed down from generations after generations only by the word of the mouth, the artist really leaving an individual signature. For our clarity, let us divide the category folk and see how it is distinct from the other category, that is the classical and the contemporary. The essential point of a classical art is that it is written and codified. That means it has an authoritative text, whereas folk is loosely structured. Contemporary incorporates a range of different styles to create its own unique look. Classical is formally learned because it has its own code of conduct, that is why it has to be formally learned, whereas folk is orally passed on and contemporary is self taught. In classical art, author is always known, but folk is In folk, the author is unknown. Contemporary, it is individualistic. Classical represents a nation, folk more often than not always represents a region. Contemporary is transnational. Classical survives time, folk also survives time, in fact it is known as timeless. Contemporary is mostly short lived. The theme of classical art is spiritual and philosophical, whereas the theme of folk is natural cycle and mundane. In contemporary, the theme is topical, that is current. The participants of a classical form is always selected because it has to be formally learned, it is codified, that is why it has to be trained, the participants have to be trained. So, the participants are selected, but folk, as because it is not formally learned and it does not have a code, everyone can participate. And in contemporary also it is selected participants because it also has to be formally learned. So, we can list out the characteristics of folk category as following. Common people are the mainstay of folk art. Folk art may accompany the celebration of various religious, social and family festivals, fertility cult, human and land, as well as the problems of natural disaster like flood, famines and fire, diseases and accidents directly or indirectly provide the theme of folk art. Textual source or authorship is not important, it is orally transmitted. Folk art are often a mixture of genres, music, dance, songs, drama. The division in music, dance or drama is made based on the emphasis of the form. That is to say that a folk art may contain dramatic element, musical element or dance element, but the form which is more prominent becomes it gets its name. Like dance also has a narrative, it also has a story, it also has drama, but because it is more performative it gets its name as dance. The purpose of folk art can be summed up in three folds: social transaction, that is to exchange between the members of a group, the cultural exchange. It is ritualistic performance, many folk art are done during rituals, during festivals or during some observations, and entertainment, it is a sense of relaxation. So, these are some of the characteristics of folk art category. So, now we come to Indian folk art. Mark Twain had famously said this about India, that India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend and the great grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most instructive material in the history of man are treasured up in India only. This is to say that India is a treasure of rich culture. The richness of its culture is manifested in various ways, be it music, its art, its songs, its attire or the artifacts. One of the most prominent feature of Indian folk art is the diversity. Every region has its own distinct flavor of art, and it is represented in its art, in its dance, in its narrative. So, in the following classes we hope to discuss the folk art forms of India and see how it is diverse from one another, as well as there are some overlaps.